He was born Donald Eugene Lytle on May 31st, 1938, in the rough-and-tumble town of Greenfield, Ohio, one of 9 children crammed into a home that saw more struggles than comforts. Even as a kid, his life didn't play out like a gentle ballad. It was harsher, more like a rowdy honky-tonk tune that careens from one heartbreak to another, fueled by equal parts desperation and determination. Poverty was a constant. So was a looming sense that if he wanted any real shot at life, he'd have to steal it or fight for it. By the age of 15, he was gone, hitchhiking the highways and drifting wherever the next ride took him. Petty theft, run-ins with the law, and a taste for trouble defined his early years. School simply couldn't compete with the allure of freedom, even if that freedom was often an illusion. At 17, hoping for a semblance of direction, he enlisted in the Navy. Maybe the military would channel all that restless energy into something purposeful. Maybe it would break him down so he could start anew. But discipline and Donald Lytle were never a match. By 18, he was court-martialed for assaulting an officer, and not just a shove or a scuffle. He broke the man's jaw. The Navy clamped down hard, sentencing him to 2 years in prison, a stark and sobering ordeal. According to the Tennessean's 2003 remembrance, that was the moment he crossed a line he'd never really uncross. He emerged more disillusioned, more rebellious than ever, and even more determined to carve his own path on his own terms. Somewhere along the way, between the bruises and the bars, there were early marriages, at least 2, the details of which remain murky to this day. Children came from these unions, though the kids rarely saw their father, according to a 2003 feature in the Tennessean. Donald's pattern of instability was laid out from the start. Tumble into relationships, spark what might have been love, then burn out in the flames of his own chaos. It was a dance he'd repeat for most of his adult life. As the 1950s rolled on, the young man drifted more deliberately toward music. Raised on old country, gospel, and whatever else he heard on the airwaves or in local dives, he realized he had a voice. More importantly, he had something to say, something raw and real, sharpened by nights sleeping under bridges and days spent dodging the law. Around 1958, he found himself in Nashville, the beating heart of country music, brimming with the promise of second chances. But Nashville didn't welcome him with open arms. He had to prove himself, and so he went from bar to bar, picking up gigs as a bassist, a backup singer, anything that put him closer to a microphone. He jammed with legends like Ray Price, Faron Young, and a rising superstar named George Jones. He was in the band, off to the side of the spotlight, but he soaked up everything, watching how these established artists handled themselves on stage and off. Then came the transformation. Donald Eugene Lytle disappeared, and Johnny Paycheck walked in. The name was supposedly inspired by a boxer. Paycheck by name, paycheck by nature, perhaps. It was 1958, and by ditching his old identity, he hoped to finally outrun that weighty baggage of arrests and regrets. This was a new beginning, or so he told himself. Within a few years, he'd landed a deal with Little Darlin' Records. In 1965, he officially hit the scene, but real success knocked on his door in 1966 with The Lovin' Machine, which climbed into the top 10 on the country charts. Audiences heard something distinctive in his voice. It was the grit of a man who'd seen dark nights and still believed in the next sunrise. He embodied honky-tonk authenticity at a time when country music was starting to fracture into slick commercial polish on one side and raw outlaw passion on the other. Paycheck couldn't have been anything but raw outlaw passion. In the late 1960s, right around the time his career began to flicker, he met and married Sharon Paisley. Most sources don't agree on the exact date, but it was definitely during the run-up to his first real stardom. Sharon was a stabilizing force, or at least she tried to be. In 1970, she gave birth to their son, Jonathan. It was the period when Paycheck was still juggling small-time records and bar gigs, soon to find a bigger stage. Life with Sharon teetered between domestic semi-bliss and behind-closed-doors volatility. He drank, he brawled, she stayed. They slogged through the tense early 1970s together, witnessing his steady ascent, but paying a price in emotional turmoil. She'd later recall, in a 2003 Rolling Stone tribute, he was a good man, just lost. They clung to each other until 1982, when his spiraling behavior, worsening booze binges, legal threats, fights, finally tore them apart. The divorce left a bruise he never fully admitted, but those who knew him best said the loss of Sharon rattled him more than he'd ever confess. Meanwhile, his music career was hitting new heights, thanks in large part to a partnership with producer Billy Sherrill at Epic Records. In 1971, after bouncing around, Paycheck signed with Epic and embraced a sound that combined twangy tradition and the more polished approach Sherrill was famous for. It worked. He racked up chart success with songs like She's All I Got, which reached number 1. Someone to Give My Love To, number 2 in 1971. 4 in 1972. Country radio loved him, that bruised baritone, the southern drawl, the sense that he might detonate at any minute if provoked. He was captivating in the same way a storm on the horizon is captivating. You can't look away. But the real jackpot arrived in 1977 with Take This Job and Shove It, a number 1 phenomenon penned by David Allen Coe. The track struck a deep chord with every working stiff who dreamed of telling the boss off. It sold over 2 million copies, becoming not just a country smash, but a cultural catchphrase. Suddenly, Paycheck was on talk shows, in newspapers, on bumper stickers. People who didn't even follow country music knew the phrase, take this job and shove it. And it gave voice to a shared fantasy of defiance. The song later spun off into a 1981 comedy film by the same name, and though Paycheck wasn't the star, his signature track fueled the entire premise. For a guy who'd spent so long on the run, now the whole nation was chasing after him, wanting that voice, that attitude, that sneer of rebellion. The late 1970s were a victory lap of sorts. He joined the Grand Ole Opry in 1977, which signaled a newfound respect within the country establishment. He churned out hits, including I'm the Only Hell Mama Ever Raised and Slide Off of Your Satin Sheets, both charting in 1977. He had 11 top 10 singles that decade, tying outlaw grit to heartbreak ballads in a way that felt both classic and risky. He wasn't as smooth as some of his contemporaries, far from it, but fans loved that realness. Around the same time, he collaborated with George Jones on duets like You Better Move On, 1979. Their voices blending like 2 barroom buddies, lamenting life's painful ironies. Yet Johnny Paycheck remained Johnny Paycheck. He was a man who could sabotage success as easily as he found it. In 1980, just 3 years after his triumphant induction, he got himself expelled from the Grand Ole Opry. The official reasons were tangled in the usual storms of bar fights, missed appearances, and general legal woes, but it all boiled down to this: you couldn't tame him, and he wouldn't apologize enough to patch things up. His hits slowed, though he still commanded a certain respect among fans who admired his outlaw spirit. By the early 1980s, his personal life was shuddering under the weight of destructive habits. He and Sharon Paisley divorced in 1982. She'd endured more than her fair share of fights and heartbreak, and the drinking had escalated to a point of no return. Paycheck himself seemed unmoored, bouncing from fleeting romantic entanglements, like a brief marriage to Lou Ann Pierce in the 1970s, to nights he wouldn't remember. According to People magazine in 1991, he admitted, "I was my own worst enemy." His restless behavior caught up with him in the worst way in December 1985. In a Hillsboro, Ohio bar, an argument about turtle soup, yes, turtle soup, turned violent. Paycheck pulled a gun and shot a man named Larry Wise. Luckily for everyone involved, the bullet only grazed Wise's head, but that was enough for the law to throw the book at Paycheck. He was convicted of aggravated assault in 1986 and handed a 7-year prison sentence. It might have been the end of his story right there. His legal troubles had piled up for years, DUI charges, bar brawls, disputes with bandmates, you name it. And now a judge finally decided it was time to make him pay. He was in his late 40s, a once major star overshadowed by lurid headlines. And yet fate, or perhaps a well-placed political favor, intervened. Governor Richard Celeste commuted his sentence in 1990. Paycheck ended up serving just 22 months, from 1989 to 1991, emerging from prison older, chastened, but not altogether beaten. Strangely enough, even as the scandal thundered, his music wasn't entirely silenced. In 1985, just before the fateful shooting, he signed with AMI Records. He recorded Old Violin in 1986, and it charted at number 21, a modest showing, but the song's impact went deeper than numbers. Old Violin was a late career confession of sorts, a weary reflection on his life, a battered man acknowledging the toll of years filled with violence and mistakes. Fans and critics alike saw it as a haunting masterpiece, one that distilled Johnny Paycheck's story down to a few mournful minutes of raw, unfiltered honesty. The prison stint cost him momentum, and by the time he got out in 1991, country music had shifted gears. New stars like Garth Brooks and Alan Jackson were dominating the airwaves with a more mainstream polish. Still, Paycheck's loyalists stood by him. He tried to rebuild, releasing an album here and there, playing smaller venues. In 1998, recognition came in the form of the Country Legends Hall of Fame, a nod to his undeniable influence on the outlaw scene, sometimes overshadowed by bigger names like Waylon Jennings, Willie Nelson, and Merle Haggard. Paycheck nonetheless had staked his claim as a true rebel who'd lived the outlaw image in a way that almost no one else dared. Despite all the fiascos, the music industry knew what he'd contributed to their legacy. The final chapter of his life was marked by decline, physical, financial, personal. He battled emphysema and diabetes, complications from decades of heavy smoking, drinking, and general disregard for his health. By the 1990s, he'd shed over 100 pounds, according to a 2003 Billboard article. George Jones, that old friend and sometimes partner in crime, stepped in to help cover Paycheck's mounting medical bills. Jones still believed in him, still loved him, and recognized that beneath the tarnished reputation was a man who had once shared stages and stories with the best of country music. And maybe Jones felt they were bonded by the same devils that had plagued them for so long. In 2001, Paycheck tried to remind the world he still had something left with an album titled Survivor. It was a testament to his refusal to stay down, even if his voice didn't pack the same punch it once did. The spirit was there, though, every bit of it. He wanted people to know he was still fighting, still alive. He had clocked 24 top 10 hits in his career, 5 of them hitting number 1. And that success didn't vanish, even if new hits were no longer coming his way. His real legacy was intertwined with the outlaw movement, with that gritty, defiant brand of country that was more about telling it like it is than polishing it for the masses. But that last stand was cut short. On February 19, 2003, Johnny Paycheck died in Nashville at age 64, succumbing to respiratory failure. The man who'd outlived his own prophecies of doom finally met the one opponent he couldn't best. In his final weeks, the medical bills piled even higher. George Jones again offered support, making sure his old comrade would be cared for. The funeral wasn't a massive spectacle, but it was attended by those who truly understood what Paycheck meant to country music. They laid him to rest at Woodlawn Memorial Park in Nashville. A year later, in 2004, Jones funded his headstone as a final salute, a last gesture of respect between two men who had shared songs and storms. After his death, the tributes rolled in. David Allan Coe called him a true outlaw, according to a 2003 segment on CMT. The label felt right, and not just in the marketing sense. Paycheck had lived it. For better or worse, he never played by the rules. He'd ride that rocket ship of success straight into the sun and find himself burning up. Yet somehow he always came back, at least until his body gave out. Critics and fans alike reflect on how his story is one of heartbreak and defiance, of a man who embodied the roughest edges of country soul. He was no saint, and he wouldn't have claimed to be. He was the guy who made a razor-sharp tune out of his boss-hating fantasies, who got himself tossed from the Opry, who shot a man in a bar because of some words over a bowl of turtle soup. But he was also the man who could deliver She's All I Got or Old Violin with such naked feeling that it could stop you in your tracks. So if you wander through the dusty corners of classic country, you'll find him, a stray dog among pedigreed show ponies, a rebellious spirit who couldn't quite harness his own extremes. But there's a reason that even after all these years, through divorces, prison sentences, and near-mythic bar tales, people still stream his music, still, quote, take this job and shove it, and still feel a pang of empathy when they hear, oh, violin. Johnny Paycheck might have been his own worst enemy, as he once admitted, but he was also a voice of the underdog, the restless, the working stiff, and the soul who knows that some scars never fully heal. He died at 64, but the story didn't end with his last breath. Every honky-tonk tribute, every heartfelt cover by a young artist who wants to tap into that raw nerve of authenticity, every streaming count that creeps higher year after year, all of it keeps him alive in the place he always seemed to long for most, the world of unapologetic country music. And maybe in that sense, Johnny Paycheck finally found something he couldn't break or lose, a legacy as ragged and real as the man himself.